Okay, then, if I could ask you to mute yourselves so that we don't impinge on his the Lord High Admiral. He's taking his hat off again. I'm quite disappointed. Chris, whenever you're ready.
Okay, so popular memory of the First World War is often mostly about the army being bogged down in the trenches, slaughter on the Somme, lions led by donkeys. No, hang on. Yeah, that's right. Biplanes, the Red Baron, dueling Lord Flashheart. Popular memory doesn't really remember the Navy's involvement. You might be lucky and get people talk about Jutland. Could get the Falklands. A lot of people will say U-boats, but they'll be thinking of the wrong war. And Lusitania. Lusitania is quite popular. You might even get someone say the Titanic, but they don't understand. But there's a lot more to the Navy war. It's a lot more complicated, and it has much more of an impact on the war. Probably upset people by saying arguably won the war, but I'll get to that a bit later. But it makes the navies of all the participants make this a global conflict and dictate some of the theaters. Before I really get into the meat of the thing, though, I'm not very good with the technical stuff and being able to identify ships like by classes and whatever. Some people are able to look at ships and go, "Oh, that's a Iron Duke class battle cruiser or something." I'm not very good with that, but I am going to be running through mentioning different types of ships. So I thought I'd do a quick breakdown of some of the more common ships that will turn up, such as the gunboat. This is the SMS Ilz of the Ilz class. Most of her class were in Tsingtao Harbour to defend against invaders, which they failed horrifically because they are just small coastal ships, really. They're not good for open ocean. They're really just colonial police force in the German Empire. These would basically roll up at an island, fire off all their guns to scare the natives and remind them that they belong to Germany, and then sail off. Following that, we have the destroyer. Destroyers are fast and small. They can't carry a lot of coal, so they have limited range. And they have very limited armor, if any. But their main weapon is the torpedo. They're able to cut through cruiser screens, get into the battleships, put a torpedo in a ship, which is what happened at Jutland. I keep getting the name wrong, but it's the Poznan was sunk by a torpedo from a destroyer when it hit a magazine, blew up and killed the entire crew. So these are really quite deadly, but they're quite short range. After that, you have the light cruisers. This is the Emden, which I will come to later. Can't really talk about the German Navy without mentioning Emden. It's the main naval scout and long-range colonial enforcer. It has light armor over important things like turrets, bridge, engines, but that's about it. But they're quite fast and useful. Above that, this is possibly the most beautiful ship in the First World War, if not of all time. This is von Space flagship, the Scharnhorst, and it is an armored cruiser. These are bigger, slower, more heavily armored, more heavily armed, and they're designed mainly to assist battleships in fleet engagements and or something that the light cruisers could then fall back onto. After that, you have the battle cruiser. This is HMS Lion. It's BT's flagship. They are kind of a mongrel breed between armored cruiser and battleship, in that they're fast like a cruiser, they're armored like a cruiser, they're armed like a battleship. They were known as Fisher's Greyhounds, and they are used for advanced scouting because they've got quite a clout, they've got quite a speed, and they're usually the first people who get in. They're the ones that get in amongst everybody, especially if like BT or HIPA are in charge. They're deadly, but there aren't that many of them in comparison to the other ships. Now we move on to the big boys. This is the pre or semi-dreadnought battleships. Now, before 1905, any battleship that was laid down before 1905 has the old style of armament, in which case they've usually got 2 turrets on the center, and then the majority of their weapons are secondary, so they're all a lot smaller, and they're mounted on their broadside. That's mainly for dealing with torpedo boats or anything that can get in close. but also because they're still fighting on the Napoleonic style of forming up and then giving each other broadsides and blowing the 7 lots of hell out of each other, which is fine. But in 1905, you get the Dreadnought. Now, this is not HMS Dreadnought. This is, for a variation, this is an Austro-Hungarian Dardanelles class Dreadnought. But the Dreadnoughts have central turrets, less secondary armament, if any, and their main thing is to try and blow the heck out of each other at long range. They're faster, they've got better armor, and in a fight between a pre-Dreadnought and a Dreadnought, Dreadnoughts win all the time. There's been a bit of a naval race. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's just before our period, really. But in 1889, the British brought out the Naval Defence Act, where they decided that they needed to have twice the Royal Navy had to be bigger than the next two rivals. So through the late 19th century, they had to have twice the amount of ships of Russia and France combined. When the Germans in the early 20th century decided to expand their navy for the colonial empire, Britain wanted to put them in the mix as well. And so every time the Germans brought out another couple of battleships, England had to make 4, and so they're getting more and more. But by the beginning of the war, the Germans are massively outnumbered with dreadnoughts. There are other ships that take part in the war. You've got unprotected and protected cruisers. Aircraft carriers start to become a thing. Monitors. I'm going to mention them, but not in too much detail. U-boats are going to come up quite a lot, and this will be my Zeppelin clacks. And Zeppelins were used by the German Navy for scouting ahead of the fleet because they could just fly high above everyone else. So the two sides, as the war commences between the two sides, you have the following navies taking part. For the Etienne, you've got the Royal Navy, who are the biggest navy in the world, followed by France. France's navy is a little bit dated. They've got some really old ships, but still quite numerous, still quite capable. And then the Russian Navy, which took a hell of a drubbing in 1905 to the Japanese, but is getting back on its feet. Against them is the glorious Imperial German Navy, and that's about it. But there is also the Austro-Hungarian Navy, who everyone sort of forgets, because we always think of Austria as quite landlocked, but they did indeed have a navy, and it had several ships, but the ones worth mentioning was the 3 modern light cruisers, which were really quite fast, and 4 dreadnoughts. So they are a player. They're just not they're kind of like the Tottenham Hotspur of navies, in that they're kind of middle league. They're enough to worry about, but not lose too much sleep over. Which leads me to, but that sounds all pretty straightforward, that all you have to do is outnumber the Germans in the North Sea. The problem is the German fleet is actually scattered across the world, as you can see by this high-class graphic that I spent yesterday making. You have German ships scattered. Most of their fleet is concentrated in the North Sea. However, in the Mediterranean, you've not only got the Austro-Hungarians, you've also got the powerful, forgive my pronunciation, Mittelmeergeschwader, consisting of the battle cruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau. The Mediterranean is vital to the Allied war effort because obviously they have imperial redeployment, which I'm going to go into in a minute, and having a German battle cruiser and light cruiser wanging it around in the Mediterranean means that you can't have troop ships coming through. Further off into the Pacific, you've got the small but very capable Ostasiengeschwader under a fantastic commander in the form of Admiral von Spee, which is stationed in China. This polices the German Empire's holding, and at this point they're kind of scattered around the theatre, but they are present. In the Americas, you've got Dresden and Karlsruhe in the Caribbean. New York is full of liners which can leave at any time, meet up one of the German cruisers, be issued with weapons and become an auxiliary. And on the west coast, you've got Leipzig and Nuremberg cruising up and down. So, and off Africa, I forgot Africa. Africa's a lot easier. There's the gunboat Eber off Sudwest Africa, and Königsberg off in East German Africa. but they are pretty much scattered, and so they do need to be dealt with. Right, who's managing this? Well, for Germany, we have the Kaiser. He's overall in charge of everything at all times. And although he's very passionate, he loves the Navy. He doesn't know much about it, though. He's not very au fait with naval things. But if you excuse the pun, he does like to put his oar in from time to time. The person who is more capable is his brother, Prince Heinrich. He's actually well respected. He's done all the sailing training. He's been a commander of the fleet. He even was the person that suggested that a flying squadron of dreadnoughts be made available to sail to the colonies, and actually took 3 of them on a tour of the world, which ended just before the July crisis. Then you have Alfred von Tirpitz, who he was a man who drove German naval rearmament and has planned it all. He's minister for the Marine at one point, and he's still in charge. And then you have 2 up-and-coming officers. I could only fit one on the slide, but in the form of Reinhard Scheer and Franz von Hipper, but more on them later. For Britain, the first naval sea lord is Louis von Battenberg. He's a fantastic peacetime sea lord, not too good at wartime. They have some quite early setbacks, and his German, being German, doesn't help him much, and he's forced to retire quite soon into the war, to be replaced by Jackie Fisher, who is a tireless workhorse, very strong opinions, and everyone that agrees with him will get on fine because his opinions are always right, according to him. Unfortunately, he is buddied up with the government minister in the form of a Liberal MP, who's again very passionate, like the Kaiser, is very passionate about the Navy, doesn't really understand it, gives it a good crack, Winston Spencer Churchill, who's also believes that his way is the right way. So you can imagine how well him and Fisher got on. The commander-in-chief of the Grand Fleet gets changed just before the war starts, and Admiral Jellicoe takes command. He's a safe pair of hands. He's playing the long game. He's playing the strategy. He knows what he's got a vision in his head of how he's going to win this war. The head of the scouting force of battle cruisers is Admiral Beatty. He is of the Nelson school of let's get among them, let's cause havoc, let's blow stuff up, let's charge off over here, which has its place, apparently. Other commanders we have for the other players, we have Anton Haus, who is the commander-in-chief of the Austro-Hungarian Navy. He understands that the Austro-Hungarian economy, which was mostly being landlocked, they don't want to spend a lot of money on the Navy. So what he's got has to be protected at all times. He's not keen to get involved in a naval war. He would like to preserve his fleet for as long as possible. And for the Ottomans, when they start the war, we have Vice Admiral Wilhelm Souchon aboard the German battle cruiser Goeben. He, although head of the Ottoman Navy, he really does just represent German needs and what the Germans want in Ottoman Turkey, and in fact drags them into the war. Now, the war aims of these nations is pretty straightforward. Britain and the Allies want to contain the Central Powers fleets into port, neutralize foreign station vessels, preferably by destruction over internment, because then you know they're not going to be a problem, interdicting German trade and blockading the North Sea, which should bring Germany to its knees as it did Napoleon. They would also need to facilitate the redeployment of British and French troops from colonial garrisons, which is the imperial redeployment. If they can bring home British regiments and replace them with local troops, it would help on the Western Front. So they're moving battalions of like the East Kents from India, the South Wales borderers from China, and replacing them with like Indian Army troops, just for the moment until they can deal with the German threat. The Germans realize that they're outgunned, outnumbered. So what they're going to try and do is chip away at the British numerical superiority as much as they can. Lots of small engagements, sink a few ships here or there, and withdraw, and try and keep their fleet in as powerful position as possible. the foreign stations ships to cause as much havoc as possible, cruiser warfare, which is basically piracy. The Austro-Hungarians don't want any of this at all whatsoever. Britain and France have then divided their responsibilities because they can't police both. So France takes the Mediterranean, Britain takes the North Sea and the Channel. The Channel is absolutely vital to resupplying any British army that goes into France and Belgium. The main battle fleet goes up to Scapa Flow. The battle cruisers go to the Firth of Forth. You have a cruiser force with destroyers and submarines at Harwich. And the pre-dreadnoughts are concentrated at Portland and the Nor/Sheppey in an anti-invasion measure, but also to help secure the Channel and to provide a limited artillery support for the army on the north coast of France and bombarding German facilities in Belgium. Right. So there was as the war starts, there is this expectation that the Germans are going to sail out and there's going to be a god almighty battle like Jutland in August 1914. But the Germans aren't stupid, so that doesn't happen. So the Grand Fleet go out waiting for them, but they're not there. So what happens is the war starts slowly with aggressive mining. That's a sea mine that's at the Imperial War Museum that with my youngest son as scale, just in case no one has seen a sea mine. So laying mines is like the army digging trenches. You put them along coastlines and in areas where you don't want the enemy to turn up, mainly across where your ports and forts are, with routes that you know that your captains are aware of, so that they can sail in and out. But the British then couldn't like sneak into the Jade Estuary and blow stuff up. They also release the minefield maps to neutral countries, so that the Norwegians won't accidentally sail into a minefield. But you also get aggressive mining, where you have ships and U-boats going in and mining the enemy's waters, such as the Thames Estuary. The first German ship to be lost is the civilian Königin Louise, which had been laying mines in the Thames Estuary. It was caught by the cruiser Amphion and promptly sunk. Then Amphion sailed away back into the estuary, into the German minefield, and sank herself. Her commander, Cecil Fox, then took command of HMS Undaunted and ran into a group of German torpedo boats off Texel, who were going to do the same thing, and promptly sunk them all. The most famous and embarrassing mine incident was on the 27th of October, when the Dreadnought HMS Audacious, here on the right, struck a mine laid by the liner SS Berlin off the coast of Ireland and sank, with only one casualty. Whilst the Admiralty tried to keep this secret and bury it, unfortunately for them, the liner RMS Olympic happened to be nearby, and in fact was trying to help tow Audacious. And it had a lot of American civilians on board who took several photos like this one. They then sold it to the American press, and it was made public before the Admiralty had acknowledged it. And the Germans were very, very pleased with that. Other than mines, you get U-boats and submarines. The first the first ship ever to be sunk by a modern submarine was HMS Pathfinder, which was sunk by Otto Hersing's U-21 on the 5th of September off the Isle of May. Following that, on the 22nd of September, Otto Vedigen, pictured here on the left, in U-9 sank 3 armoured cruisers, Hogue, Cressy and Abaca, in 40 minutes. 1,459 men, all killed before breakfast. It was like 6 o'clock in the morning, and they just wiped them out. British submarines were just as deadly, though. Max Horton, who goes on to have prominent submarine command in World War II, aboard HMS E9, sank the Aviso Hella on the 13th of September, and then the torpedo boat S116 on the 6th of October, both of them in German territorial waters. When the Russians called for naval assistance in the Baltic, it was all the Royal Navy could do but to send a couple of submarines. And so Horton and Noel Lawrence, who's pictured here with him, took their submarines into the Baltic and caused absolute merry havoc, up until the point that the Kaiser ordered that no capital ships should go to sea unless absolutely necessary. But it's not all just submarines and mines and skulking around. You also have some really interesting battles. On the 28th of August, the Royal Navy launched a daring raid on the German naval bases in the Jade Estuary in overwhelming numbers and sank 3 of the patrolling cruisers, whilst the High Seas Fleet, with all its dreadnoughts and battle cruisers, sat behind a sandbar because the tide was wrong and they couldn't sail out to meet them. The Germans were not happy about this, and the biggest raid was on the 16th of December, when a force of 4 battle cruisers and an armoured cruiser attacked Hartlepool, Scarborough and Whitby before getting away unscathed, much to Britain's embarrassment. But whilst the Germans celebrated this daring success, which had not been done since the Napoleonic War, there were 86 civilians killed, and this galvanized anti-German feelings. Suddenly, the beastly Hun wasn't just ravaging Belgium, but they were attacking our shores as well. They'd also attacked Yarmouth on the 3rd of November, and it was not going to be the last raid on the mainland, on British mainland. Okay, so in the Mediterranean, the first real hiccup happened in the first days of the war, literally the first days of the war. Susion took Goeben and Breslau to go and meet with the Austro-Hungarian fleet. Unfortunately, much like me, he was stood up and decided to go it alone. So he goes to the ports of Philippeville and Bonn, hoping to in Algeria. The French were about to move the Algerian corps from Africa to France, and his plan was to destroy as many, get amongst the troop ships and destroy as many of them as possible. However, when he got to the port, he found there was not many ships there at all. So he goes back to Sicily, outrunning the British battle cruisers, who were still neutral at this point. There were still hours to go before Britain declared war. And so he gets to Sicily and opens orders from Berlin, which tell him to change course for Turkey. Now, what follows is a monumental British cock-up. This is the only kind of cock-up that we could come up with, and a misunderstanding of orders, which weren't particularly clear. So Goeben and Breslau heading east at pace. Admiral Trowbridge, who is at the mouth of the Adriatic, who's meant to be watching for the Austro-Hungarian fleet in case it sallies south, goes to engage Goeben. However, the orders from Churchill stated, "Do not engage a superior force without French assistance." As far as Trowbridge was concerned, through the night, Goeben represented a superior force. It was faster than him. His guns had a longer range than any of his ships, and could ultimately take out his force at range without getting anywhere near. So he chickened out and stopped. He was court-martialed. He was found innocent, but his career was over pretty much. Admiral Milne, his commander-in-chief, was based in Malta. He took a leisurely sail east behind the Germans, believing that any moment now Goeben would turn round. It didn't. And what he found when they finally reached the Dardanelles Straits, they found that the Narrows were closed to him, and that Goeben had been renamed the Yavuz Selim, manned by Germans wearing fezzes, and the new Turkish naval head was Susion. Susion didn't wait for the Ottomans to decide whether they wanted to be in the war or not. And on the 29th of October, he sailed out into the Black Sea on exercises and attacked, amongst other places, Odessa and Sevastopol, causing Russia to get really hacked off with the Ottomans and declare war on them. And then everybody followed suit. In the Far East, we have another German who was in a hurry. In this case, Captain von Müller of the Emden, who put to sea immediately and took out a Russian ship in the Korean Gulf on the first day of the war. The situation in the Far East was very tenuous for Germany, and the Germans' Admiralty said to von Spee, "You've got a free hand. We're not going to tell you what to do. You know the area better than us. You can organise your own forces and what to do." The biggest issue for the British was the German wireless network. I think there's a post-war wireless station on the right, but it gives you a rough idea. This network allowed Berlin to give orders to German warships, German trading ships, colliers, supply ships, and they could try and play a giant game of nautical chess. So the British decided that the best thing to do is to take these wireless stations out. This led to the the very small Togoland campaign, just to take out one wireless station. The raids on the Australian raids on New Guinea, and the bombardment of the island of Yap. Both British Admiralty and Australian Parliament then interfere with their admirals on the stations, which gives von Spee time to escape. Von Spee decides he's getting the hell out of there. He's going to try and get his ships back to Germany. It also gives Emden room to operate as a raider, and the Allies, but the Allies do manage to blockade Tsingtao and then attack it, supported by the Japanese. They also, the navies also support the New Zealand landings in Samoa, the Australian landings in New Guinea, and all the little islands, which weren't so much taken over as someone sailed past them and said, "You now belong to us." Right, the American station. This is a bit more scattered, but you have it's a lot more problematic as well, because most of the places are neutral, which means the German ships are allowed to go in and resupply, and so you can have colliers bringing coal in and out to warships. As I said earlier, you've got the Karlsruhe and Dresden in the Caribbean. Dresden heads south for the Plate Estuary. Karlsruhe arms the Kronprinz Wilhelm liner, and then they go into raiding. The Leipzig, seen here on the left, sails north towards San Francisco. Canada panics, and they send half their navy to go and deal with this German raider that could be coming towards them. Half their navy consists of HMCS Rainbow, which is the ship on the right, which is a protected cruiser, and a training ship, which went out without proper ammunition on the first time. Luckily for both sides, neither of them ran into each other, and Leipzig turned south again. She was then joined up with Dresden and was called to East Island, where von Spee had occupied. There we go. There he is. And together, the German, with all the colliers that they'd amassed, they headed off to Chile with an aim to head south for the Cape. However, they bumped into Kit Craddock, who on the right, whose American squadron had come up looking for any German raiders. What follows is the Battle of Coronel. The painting on the left, they didn't get that close at all, but it was a massacre. The von Spee just absolutely dominated the ships. I'm not going to go into the whole campus thing, but both British armored cruisers were lost with all hands. Fisher, who's now taken over at the Admiralty, responds immediately. And on the 8th of December, when the Germans arrived at the Falkland Islands to steal coal, they find that the battle cruisers Invincible and Inflexible, support with a large fleet of cruisers, are there. By the end of the day, only the Dresden escapes. The picture shows survivors of the Gneisenau being picked up by a British battle cruiser. I forget which one, I think it's Inflexible. Dresden escapes to the islands south of the Cape, where she holds down several British ships who spend months looking for her, but is eventually overpowered at Robinson Crusoe Island and sunk. Just as a brief aside, when I said about an example of Fisher, when I said he only likes people who agree with him, he really didn't like Vice Admiral Sturdy, who had gone out to Falkland Islands. And when he did return, and he said, "We've sunk all these German ships, we've had the victory. The only thing Fisher was interested in was the amount of ammunition that they'd expended," and promptly bollocked him. But we still have the individual raiders. So we have Emden, which is probably the most famous. She sailed into Madras Harbour and blew up the oil, bombarded the oil drums, as you can see there, without killing any civilians. She then sailed into Penang Harbour and sank the Russian cruiser Zemchug. Before, and quite fitting that this is on Anzac Day, the first Australian naval victory of the war, HMAS Sydney caught her at Direction Island and promptly sunk her. And apparently, the friend of mine who worked at the Australian War Museum said they won't stop going on about it, which is fair enough. Karlsruhe was just as successful, but exploded in November due to an ammunition problem. Königsberg in East Africa was notable for sinking the city. It's my favourite fact of the war. She sank the SS City of Winchester, which was carrying the first of the tea harvest. When the Admiralty then closed the Red Sea until they could scour it for the Königsberg, it stopped tea being imported into Britain. So in September 1914, there is a tea shortage in London. So you can imagine the panic. Königsberg then goes on to sink the Pegasus in harbour, then ended up hiding in the Rufiji River. The British had to try and dig her out using aircraft for spotting. You get monitors. It's really quite an interesting story if you get a chance to read it. I'm not going to go too much now. You also had the arming of civilian liners, such as the Kaiser Wilhelm de Gross on the left. You can see how well she did, and the Kronprinz Wilhelm on the right. They're not military ships, really. They're not armored. They've got guns. They get guns attached to them by German warships or in harbour, but they guzzle too much coal, and they're just not designed for the war that they're being used. In the case of the Wilhelm de Grosse, she ran into HMS Highflyer, very old cruiser, but was able to just blow the hell out of her. Kronprinz Wilhelm was just in severe, dire need of maintenance. It's hard to tell from that picture being so small, but she was absolutely ranted by the time she interned. Okay, so 1915 does not start well for the Royal Navy. Literally New Year's Day, the small hours of the morning, HMS Formidable, a pre-Dreadnought battleship, is torpedoed and sunk by a U-boat off Portland, killing 547 men. But it does give us Lassie, which I can come to later. And it just proves again how powerful the U-boat is against warships. The U-boat in question had been stalking Formidable and the squadron that she was attached to for quite some time through the night. But before I go into submarines, I should really I'm going to sort of go over the prize rules. Cruisers, this was originally for cruisers, but submarines were signed up to this as well. When you see a merchant ship, you have to be on the surface and fly your nation's flag, and you signal them to surrender. If they refuse to surrender, you can fire a warning shot at them. If they still don't stop, you can disable their ship. But it is imperative that you try and take the crew off and put them in lifeboats, signal someone to say that they're there where they are, and then you can sink the ship if it's got any contraband upon it. However, the U-boat captains weren't overly happy about this because the British started ramming the U-boats and sinking them. So they were a bit nervous, understandably, because they have a right. Not only are they worried about the lives of their crew and of their ship, they're also worried about themselves. They did start to bite, and so the German Navy argued that a counter blockade should be enforced. Von Pohl, the head of the Navy's High Seas Fleet at that time, entered the waters around the UK, would not be safe, and they would be sunk and fired upon without warning as of the 18th of February. But unrestricted warfare is very bad for diplomatic relations. The first US vessel to be sunk was a schooner called the William P. Fry by the raider Prinz Eitel Friedrich, but although it was contested, it wasn't such as big a problem as the sinking of the steamship Falada on the 28th of March, which killed 104 people, including the US citizen Leon Thrasher. The most famous victim of unrestricted U-boat warfare would be Lusitania. She was sunk on the 7th of May 1915 without warning. 1,198 people were killed aboard, including 104 Americans. President Wilson protested angrily, demanding that Germany cease unrestricted U-boat warfare, killing innocent civilians. However, RMS Arabic was torpedoed on the 19th of August, killing 44, including 3 more Americans. And Germany hurriedly told all commanders to cease attacking civilian liners. In the Mediterranean, the German U-boats didn't have to worry about it because they were flying the Austrian flag, so it didn't really impact them at all. That was until the sinking of the Ancona, which was sunk without warning, killing 300 people, including 20 Americans, and that immediately Austria quickly put a stop to it as well. And it was also the sinking of the Ancona was also a driving factor for Italy to come in on the Allied side. The unrestricted submarine warfare was stopped until 1917, but it was later resumed, mainly due to the impotence of the High Seas Fleet, which I'll come to in a bit, and with the British blockade really starting to cause shortages. They felt that was the only thing they could do would go into unrestricted warfare, and this is what then brings Brazil and helps drag America into the war. It also causes Royal Navy's most audacious raid. We just had the anniversary the other day on St. George's Day, the Zeebrugge raid, where Keyes masterminded the plan to sink a couple of block ships in Zeebrugge harbour to stop U-boats coming out. Didn't work, but it was a fantastic raid. Right. Before I go on, I'm going to have to talk about the elephant in the room, and a lot of people know how I feel about this. The Battle of Jutland. After Dogger Bank on the 24th of January 1915 and the loss of the armoured cruiser Blucher, which is one of the most famous photos of the naval war on the right, the fleet was holed up by order of the Kaiser. By 1916, Scheer is now head of the High Seas Fleet, and he is arguing for a much more aggressive war. And so you get the raid on Lowestoft, which is the first attempt. And on the 31st of May 1916, a large force is dispatched to the North Sea with the aim of Hipper's battle cruisers luring elements of the British fleet onto Scheer's battleships where they can be destroyed, and then the Germans can withdraw. I'm not going to break the battle down because we could be here all night. There's so many phases, so many places, and so without maps, it gets really hard to keep track of everyone. But basically, the British knew the Germans were coming, so the Grand Fleet, the whole Grand Fleet, is at sea and looking for them. Hipper runs into Beatty. Hipper falls back onto Scheer. Beatty just charges after him, runs into sees the German battleships, turns tail and runs. Hipper chases him. Hipper runs into the Grand Fleet. Then through the fog come the German High Seas Fleet. Jellicoe's in position. They fire off a broadside. The Germans carry out one of their planned maneuvers. The whole fleet turns around, heads the other way, then does another U-turn. Scheer goes for another pass, hoping to have got the British off the line. They haven't. The Germans withdraw and get back to port through a messy night action. So, who won the Battle of Jutland? This is open to some debate, apparently. And the oft-quoted line is that the prisoner assaulted the jailer but remained in jail. There's also suggestions that the Germans ran away. Well, they carried out a planned maneuver to escape an enemy that was far superior in number. They weren't going to win that battle. So I suppose they did run away, but it was actually in the pre-battle orders. The British aim was to cause severe damage to the High Seas Fleet, which they didn't. As you can see on the right, this is the Seydlitz limping home. She was really down in the water. On the left, you've got HMS Indefatigable blowing up. The German plan was to do severe damage to the British fleet, which they did. They sank 20 British ships for the loss of 11. So ultimately, it's quite a bit of a stalemate. But the telling point is, for who won, is that on the 2nd of June, the British could put most of their fleet out into action again and be ready to face again. The Germans couldn't. Seydlitz was being repaired for months. And although the German fleet would go out again, it never went out in the numbers that it did at Jutland. Right, the Mediterranean, which is a lot more fun. The Royal Navy has decided that it needs to put pressure on the Turks, and Churchill comes up with this great idea that if they can punch through the Dardanelles into the Sea of Marmora, like they did in the Napoleonic War, they can sail up to Constantinople and, under the guns of the Royal Navy, dictate the surrender of the Ottoman Empire. It didn't work in the Napoleonic War. I don't know why I thought it'd work again. But on the 18th of March, they made their attempt, and the Anglo-French force sailed up the Dardanelles. However, they fell foul of a couple of well-placed mines and accurate and determined artillery fire, which forced the withdrawal and the loss of the Bouvet on the right. Also, HMS Ocean and HMS Indefatigable, so 3 battleships down in one day. The failure of this naval option then meant that there would be the Gallipoli campaign. But throughout the Gallipoli campaign, the Navy provided landing ships, resupply, hospital transfers, and also, more importantly, floating artillery support at quite a bit of risk. HMS Goliath was sat at one of these points one night when a Turkish torpedo boat sank her, killing 570 of her crew. then you get this man, finally, again, Otto Hersing rolls up with the U-21 and sinks HMS Triumph and HMS Majestic, both battleships, in 2 days. And although Churchill claims that these ships are disposable, the Navy, and more importantly, their crews, don't believe that they are. And so they have to rethink their defensive positions. The Allies were also concerned with the Goeben and the Austrian fleet, which finally puts to sea and bombards Italian cities and towns. And then on the 14th to 15th of May, 1917, tries to disperse the Otranto Barrage. Now, the Allies came up with this great idea to stop U-boats escaping the Adriatic bases by having a line of trawlers with nets and mines, which was out day and night, and basically stop submarines from escaping. So the Austrians out the surface raider fleet under Admiral Horthy, here in a deck chair on the right, to try and dissipate them, and they were really quite successful. They sank 14 trawlers that night, and as the sun came up, they turned around and tried to flee, and an Anglo-French and Italian force in full pursuit. The Austrians managed to get back under their own guns and safety, leaving the Allies looking a bit silly. I forgot to look up the name of the captain, but one of the British adjutants complained that the Italians should have done more, and if they had been British ships, they would have caught them and sunk them all. With the barrage disrupted, you get the U-boats going back out again in proper numbers, and it hots up with mine and torpedo. You end up with HMS Cornwallis sinking, being torpedoed and sunk. You also have mine attacks. Another of Titanic sisters, HMHS Britannic, is mined and sunk, and HMS Russell, another battleship, pre-Dreadnought battleship, is sunk by a mine as she sailed into Valletta Harbour in Malta. The Austrians would attempt a further raid on the 10th of June 1918 with all 4 of her dreadnoughts, but there was an attack by an Italian torpedo boat, which saw the loss of the St. Istvan. You know, you've probably seen this footage before. I'm just going to play this and have a quick drink and rest my voice. But this is footage from one of the other dreadnoughts. They actually filmed the sinking of the ship. That's not going to play, is it? Nope. Oh, hang on. Okay, so that does look a lot more quite horrific, but there was only 80 odd people who were killed. They were surrounded by the Austrian fleet. They were able to be rescued, most of them. And one of the prerequisites of the Austro-Hungarian Navy was that you could swim before you became a sailor. Not so much with the other navies. Right. Now, the war, it only feels fitting that the war's ending should end with those who fired the first shots of the war, which is the Imperial German Navy. The Kiel Mutiny of 1918 was the start of the revolution in Germany. The Austrian fleet had put down its own armed revolt in February 1918 at Cattaro, and this was caused by boredom and war weariness, and anger boiled over for the Germans as well. In October 19, Hitler planned to attack the Channel with the fleet, but the near suicidal nature of this attack, basically it's because they got wind that the German fleet would be packaged off and given off to the Allies, and the German Navy, the High Command, felt that this was a dishonourable end, and so they wanted to make one damn good show of it. However, the crews were not ready to die in this manner, and so basically they refused to do it. Souchon, who's now back in Germany, helps crush the revolt in Kiel, but with the mutineers and ringleaders being arrested over the following weeks, the crews refused to follow orders, tried to free their comrades. Long story short, Kiel is overrun by mutineers, and this leads to a domino effect throughout Germany, and it falls into anarchy, with the monarchies are then forced to lose their crowns and some of their lands, including the wonderful Princess Victoria Louise of Prussia, Duchess of Brunswick and Hanover. Okay, so life at sea. Finally, what was it like for the crews of the ships? Well, much like the army, there's lots of routine duties, but with long periods of boredom and inaction. There could be very strong camaraderie, or dislikes and hatreds for officers and other crews. And more importantly, there is always a chance of death. I mean, I know it goes without saying you're at war and there's a chance of death, but if you put to sea, there are several ways that your life could end. This could be in open action. When I say death, I don't mean just like one or two casualties. We're talking whole shipped companies in one go, such as SMS Leopard, which was auxiliary that got into a fight with the Royal Navy, lost with all hands. Quick incineration and an internal explosions, such as HMS Bulwark or HMS Vanguard, all gone in an instant with most of their crews. Lost to an unseen mine or torpedo like HMS Hampshire carrying Kitchener. Being lost in the abyss or dying of exposure, just floating around with no one to pick you up. Or being in a submarine that sinks to the bottom for no good reason, never to rise again. Finally, on a happier note, books. We all like books. Corbett and Newbolt's official history, naval operations is excellent if you can get hold of it. Any books by Hoyt are worth a read. Also, E. Keble Chatterton. They're written quite light and bouncing, kind of light on the history, but very interesting to read. Peter Hart's book, 1916, Death in the Grey Wastes on Jutland. Also, Innes McCartney's Jutland 1916, if you're into marine archaeology. Nick Hewitt's The Kaiser's Pirates is really good on cruiser warfare and cruiser creed. And there's also a great war group introduction book on this subject as well. I forget who wrote it, but I hear it's quite good. And if there are so many great memoirs that are worth reading if you can get hold of them. And that is it.